Once upon a time there was a pretty fly. He had a pretty wife, this pretty fly. But one day she flew away, flew away. She had two pretty children, but one night these two pretty children flew away into the sky, into the
Night Chill Audio presents The Night of the Hunter, written in 1953 by Davis Grubb. Read by James Ross Spencer. The Night of the Hunter. Book 1. The Hanging Man. Wilt thou forgive that sin by which I have won others to sin, and made my sin their door? A child's hand and a piece of chalk had made it. Careful, child's scrawl of white lines on the red brick of the walls beside Jander's livery stable. A crude pair of sticks for the gallows tree. A thick broken line for the rope, and then the scarecrow of the hanging man. Some passing by along that road did not see it at all. Others saw it and remembered what it meant, and thought solemn thoughts, and turned their eyes to the house down the river road. The little children, the poor little children. Theirs were the eyes for which the crude picture was intended, and they had seen it and heard along Peacock Alley the mocking child's rhyme that went with it. And now in the kitchen of that stricken house they ate their breakfast in silence. Then Pearl stopped suddenly and frowned at her brother. "John, finish your mush." John scowled, pressing his lips together, while their mother stared out the window into the yellow March morning that flowered in the dried honeysuckle along the window. A cold winter sun shot glistening rays among the early mists from the river. "John, eat your mush." "Be quiet, Pearl," cried Willa, mother of them. "Leave John be. Eat your own breakfast and hush." Yet John frowned still, watching as the little girl resumed eating and would not let the matter lie. "You're only 4.5, Pearl," he said, "and I'm 9, and you got no right telling me. Hush, John!" Willa filled the blue china cup with sputtering hot coffee and sipped the edge of it, curling her nose against the steam. And then Pearl remembered again the picture on the brick wall beside Jander's livery stable down at Crespit Landing. Pearl made them listen to the song about the hanging man. "Hing, hang, hung, see what the hangman done," chanted the little girl, and Willa, whirling, slammed the sloshing cup at the black stove top and struck the child so the 4 marks of her fingers were pink in the small flesh. "Don't you ever sing that. Ever, ever, ever!" Willa's poor thin hands were knotted into tight blue fists. The knuckles shone white like the joints of butchered fowl. Pearl would have wept, but it seemed to her that now, at last, she might get to the heart of the matter, and so withheld the tears. "Why?" she whispered. "Why can't I sing that song? The kids down at Cressup's Landing sing it. And John said—" "Never you mind what John said. God in heaven, as is my cross wasn't hard enough to bear without my own children, his own children, mocking me with it. Now hush." "Where's Dad?" "Hush! Hush!" "But why won't you tell? John knows." "Hush! Hush your mouth this minute." Willa struck the child's plump arm again, as if in so doing she might in some way obliterate a fact of existence. As if there were not a child's arm, and at all but the specific implement of her own torment and despair. Now Pearl wept in soft, faint gasps, and clutching her old doll, waddled off, breathless with outrage, into the cold hallway of the winter house. John ate on in a pale indifference, yet obscurely pleased with the justice. Willa glared pathetically at him. "And I don't want you telling her, John," she whispered hoarsely. "I don't want you breathing a word of it, you hear? I don't want her ever to know." He made no reply, eating with the child's coarse gusto, smacking his lips over the crackling mush and maple syrup. "You hear me, John? You hear what I said?" "Yes'm." And despite the soul and monstrous truth which loomed in his small world like a fairy, book ogre, despite the awareness which for so many weeks had crowded out all the other sentiments, even the present sweet comfort of breakfast in his mother's steamy kitchen, John could not help find a kind of cruel and mischievous joy as the lilt and ring of Pearl's chant pranced like a hurdy-gurdy clown in his head. "Hing, hang, hung, see what the hangman done. Hung, hang, hing, see the robber swing." It was the song the children sang. All the children at Cressup's Landing, except, of course, John and Pearl. It was the song that was made by the children whose hands had made the chalk drawing on the red brick wall by Jander's livery stable. John finished his milk in a single gulp and took the cup and plate to Willa by the sink. "Now," she said, "I'm going up to Moundsville to see your dad. Lunch is in the pantry. I'll be home to get your supper, but I might not get back till very late, John. I want you to mind Pearl today." John, already heavy with responsibility for his sister, saw no reason to further acknowledge this bidding. "Here, John, mind her now. And you, Pearl, mind what John tells you. He'll give you your lunch at noon." "Yes." "And mind what else I told you, John. Don't breathe a word about you now." "No, Hing, hang, hung." He thought absently. Why, it was almost a dancing tune. "Hung, hang, hing, see the robber swing. Hing, hang, hung. Now my song is done." Willa, by the brown mirror over the old chest of drawers, tucked her chestnut curls into the wide straw hat with the green band. "Can Pearl and me play the pianola?" "Yes, but mind you don't tear the rolls, John. That was your dad's favorite." She caught her breath, choking back a sob, as she powdered her nose slowly and stared back into the wild, grieving eyes in the mirror. Why, it was almost as if Ben would ever hear them again, those squeaky, wheezy old pianola rolls, almost as if he had just gone off on a fishing trip and would soon be back to play them and laugh, and there would be those good old times again. She bit her lip and whirled away from the face in the mirror. "And don't let Pearl play with the kitchen matches," she cried, and was gone out the door into the bitter morning. When the gray door was closed, John stood listening for the chuckle and gasp, and then the final cough and catch, and the rising whine of the old Model T. Pearl appeared in the hall doorway with the ancient doll in her arms, its chipped and corroded face not unlike her own just now, that was streaked with tears and faint gleaming stains down her plump cheeks. John listened to the old car whining up off the river road to Moundsville. Pearl snuffled. "Come on, Pearl," John said cheerfully. "I'll let you play the pianola." She stumped solemnly along behind him in the darkened parlor amidst the ghostly shapes of the muslin-draped furniture gathered all around like fat old summer women. The ancient pianola towered against the wall by the shaded window like a cathedral of fumed oak. John opened the window blind an inch to shed a bar of pale winter light on the stack of long boxes where the music was hidden. Pearl squatted and stretched a fat hand to take one. "No," he said gently. "Let me, Pearl. Mom said he wasn't to be tore, and besides you can't read what the names say." Pearl sighed and waited. "Now this here one," he announced presently, lifting a lid from a long box and gently removing the thick roll of slotted paper. "This here's a really pretty one." And he fitted the roll into the slot and snapped the paper into the clip of the wooden roll beneath the solemnly commencing pumping the pedal with his stubby toes. The ancient instrument seemed to suck in its breath. There was a hiss and a whisper in the silence before it commenced to clamor. "Wait," wailed Pearl, edging on the stool beside him. "Wait, John! Let me! Let me!" But her feet would not reach as always, and so she sat and listened and watched in stunned amazement, dumbfounded before the glorious chiming racket it made and the little black and white keys jumping up and down with never a mortal finger to touch them. Then John thought somberly, "That's Carolina in the Morning. That was one of Dad's favorites." And he could remember the time when they had all listened to it, when Ben was there, when they were together, and he knew where the tear was in the roll, and the keys would speak out in a short chord of confusion and then go rollicking off again into the mad, happy tune. Pearl hugged the old doll close and sucked her finger in dumb amazement. And when the tune was done, she sighed. "More!" "No," sighed John glumly, shuffling away into the kitchen, his heart heavy with thoughts of the good old times that were gone. "I don't feel like it, Pearl." She followed in his footsteps like a lost lamb, hugging the old doll tight as if it might someday be her last comfort, and she stood beside him at the kitchen window, nose squashed flat to the icy pane. The hanging man. Yes, they could see him dimly even now, far away down the frozen road amid the winter mist, the little white man on the red bricks. He had not gone away in the night. When you looked one way at his angular arms and legs, he quite resembled an airplane. But of course, one knew better than that. He was a neat little man with stiff arms and stiff legs and a little pointed hat, and there was a white scratch for the rope and 2 white scratches for the gallows tree. "Hing, hang, hung," whispered Pearl softly, for she knew that John would never strike her. It was only Mom who could not abide the song. "Hung, hang, hing," she crooned again, the breath of its music caught in her throat. John scolded and sketched a hinging, hanging man on the foggy window pane. "You better not let Mom catch you singing that song." "Why won't she tell, John?" because you're too little." "I'm not, John, I'm not." He said nothing, sucking his lip. He would have loved nothing more than to tell her. Since the day when the blue men had taken Ben away, the burden of this solitary knowledge was almost more than he could endure. It was not a knowing that he could share with his mother or with anyone. It was a secret that was a little world of its own. A terrible little world, like an island upon whose haunted beach he wandered alone now, like a solitary and stricken Robinson Crusoe, while everywhere about him his eyes would find the footprint of the dangling man. Ben lay back in the bunk and smiled. Preacher had stopped talking now. Preacher just sits there across the cell from Ben with those black eyes boring into him. Preacher is trying to guess. Not that Ben hadn't told Preacher everything that he told the others at the trial. Warden Stidger, Mr. McClumphrey, Judge Slathers, and the jury. Everything, that is. But the one thing they wanted most to know. Ben won't tell that to anybody. But it is kind of a game, teasing Preacher. Ben tells him the story over and over again, and Preacher sits hunched, heeding each word, waiting for the slip that never comes. "Because I was just a plumb tired of being poor. That's the large and small of it, Preacher. Just sick to death of drawing that little pay envelope at the hardware store in Moundsville every Friday. And then when I go over to Mr. Smiley's bank on payday, he opened that little drawer with all those green 10s and 50s and hundreds in it. And every time I look at it, there I just fairly choke to think of the things it would buy Willa and them kids of mine. Greed and lust." "Yes, Preacher, it was that. But I reckon it was more, too. It wasn't just for me that I wanted it." "You killed 2 men, Ben." "That's right, Preacher. One day I oiled up that little Smith & Wesson that Mr. Blankensop keeps in his roll-top desk at the hardware store, and I went up to Mr. Smiley's bank, and I pointed that gun at Mr. Smiley and the teller, Corey South, and I said for Corey to hand me over that big stack of $100 bills. Lord, you never seen such a wad, Preacher. $10,000 worth, Ben Harper." Then Mr. Smiley said I was crazy, and Corey South went for his gun in the drawer, and with that I shot him and Mr. Smiley both, and while I was reaching through to get the green stack of hundreds of Corey's dead fingers, Mr. Smiley got the gun and lifted up on the floor and shot me through the shoulder. Well, sir, I run. I got scared, and I didn't know which way was up or down before long, and so I just got out, got the car, and I come home. With the money? Yep. And then? Ben Harper smiles. While they come down the river after me about 4 that afternoon, Sheriff Wiley Tomlinson and 4 policemen. And where was you, Ben? Why, I was there, Preacher. You see, I was done running. I was just standing out back by the smokehouse with my 2 youngsters of mine, John and the little sweetheart Pearl. And the money, Ben. What about that? What about the $10,000? Ben smiled again and picked his front teeth with his thumbnail. Go to hell, Preacher, he said softly without rancor. But listen to me, Ben Harper. I'll do you no good where you're going. What good is money in heaven or hell, either one, eh, boy? Ben is silent. Preacher walks away and stands for a spell, staring out the cell window with his long, skinny hands folded behind him. Ben looks at those hands and shivers. What kind of man would have his fingers tattooed that way, he thinks. The fingers of the right hand, each one with blue letters beneath the gray, evil skin. L-O-V-E. And the fingers of the left hand done the same way, only now the letters spell out H-A-T-E. What kind of man What kind of a preacher? Ben muses and wonders softly and remembers the quick, leaping blade of the spring knife that preacher keeps hidden in the soiled blanket of his bed. But preacher would never use that knife on Ben. Preacher wants something from Ben. Preacher wants to know about the money, and you can't use a knife to get at something like that, especially with a husky fellow like Ben. Now preacher comes back and stands by Ben's bunk. Set your soul right, Ben Harper. That money bloody with Satan's own curse. And the only way it can get cleared of it is to let it do his work in the hands of good, honest poor folks. Like you, preacher, I'm a man of salvation. You, preacher, I serve the Lord in my humble way, Ben. Then says Ben Harper softly, how come they got you locked up in Moundsville Penitentiary, preacher? There are those that serve Satan's purpose against the Lord's servants, Ben Harper. And how come you got that stick knife hid in your bed blankets, preacher? I serve God, and I come not with peace, but with the sword. God blinded mine enemies when they brought me to this evil place, and I smuggled it in right under the noses of them damn guards. That sword has served me through many an evil time, Ben Harper. I'll bet it has, preacher, grins Ben, and presently preacher goes up into his bunk and lies there a while longer, muttering and praying to himself and scheming up new ways to get Ben to tell him where he hid the $10,000 of green hundreds. It's a game between them. And in a way, it's Ben Harper's salvation, this little game. In 3 days, they are coming to take Ben up to the death house, and a body has to keep busy with little games like this to keep from losing his mind at the last. A little game. A little war of wills. Ben Harper and preacher around the clock. Day after day. And Ben Harper knows that it is a game that he will win. Because preacher can talk the breath out of his body, and Ben will never tell a mortal living soul. But preacher keeps on, stubborn, unremitting. In the quaking silence of the prison night. Listen, Ben, where you're going, it won't serve you none. Tell me, boy. Buy your way to paradise now, you hear, boy? Maybe the Lord will think twice and let you into the good place if you was to tell me, boy. Tell me, have a heart. Go to sleep, preacher. Salvation. Why, it's always a last-minute business, boy. There's a day of judgment for us all, Ben Harper, and no man knows the hour. Now's your chance. Mr. Smiley and Corey South is both dead, boy. Can't nothing change that. But if you was to let that money serve the Lord's purpose, he might feel kindly towards you. Ben, are you listening to me, boy? Shut up, preacher. Ben whispers, choking back a giggle at the game. The furious little game that keeps him from thinking about the rope upstairs and his own shoes swinging 6 feet above the floor of the drop room. Listen, Ben. See this hand I'm holding up? See them letters tattooed on it? Love, Ben. Love. That's what they spell. This hand. This right hand of mine. This hand is love. But wait, Ben, look. There's enough moonlight from the window to see. Look, boy. This left hand. Hate, Ben. Hate. Now here's the moral, boy. These two hands are souls of the mortal man. Hate and love, Ben, warring once again, the other from the wound to the grave. Ben listens to this familiar sermon, shudders with a kind of curious delight as preacher rids the fingers of his two tattooed hands together and twists them horribly, cracking the knuckles as the fingers grapple one hand with the other. Warring, boy. Warring together, left hand and the right hand, hate and love, good and evil. But wait, hot dog! Oh, devil's a-losing, Ben, he's slipping, boy. And now preacher brings both hands down with a climactic crash on the wood bench by the bunks. Then he's silent, crouched in the darkness, smiling at the glory of God in his evil fingers, and waiting to see if the little drama has done anything to the boy in the lower bunk. I could build a tabernacle, Ben, to beat the Wheeling Island Tabernacle to hell and gone. Think of it, Ben, a tabernacle built with the $10,000 of cursed bloody gold. But wait, Ben, now it's God's gold. Thousands of sinners and whores and drunkards flocking to hear his word, and all because you given the money to build a temple in his name. Praise Jesus. Listen to me, boy. You reckon the Lord wouldn't change his mind about you after that? Why, shoot, Ben, he would let them little killings stand between you and the gates of glory. Hell no. Ben rises on his elbow, tired of the game now. Shut the fuck up, preacher. Shut up and go to sleep before I climb over there and stuff your bed tick down your throat. Silence again. Preacher up there in the darkness, in the thick silence of the vast prison. Preacher lying up there on his back with those tattooed fingers crisscrossed behind his sandy, shaggy head, thinking how he can worm it out of Ben Harper with only 3 days to the death house. Ben stuffs his knuckles into his teeth till he tastes blood. The rope beneath his straw tick squeaks through the rhythm of his agged little trembling. Ben Harp is quaking with agony beneath the little dream that the night's blue fingers reached out to him. Once more is that the winter afternoon on the river shore by the old house up the road from the Cressop's Landing. He is looking into the moon faces of the children, Pearl stony and silent as a graveyard cherub, and John's big eyes wide with everything Ben was telling him, while Pearl clutched the old doll against her body. "Where are you going to, Daddy?" "Away, John, away." "Dad, you're bleeding." "It's nothing, boy, just a scratched shoulder." "But there's blood, Dad." "Hush, John. Mind what I told you to do." "Yes, Dad." "And you, Pearl, you too. Mind now. You swore." Now from the corner of his eye, Ben sees the blue men with the guns in the big touring car coming down the road beyond the corner of the orchard. John's mouth is white little lines and the dark eyes follow the blue men. They circle and walk slowly in through the dead grass that rims the yard. "Now I'm going away, boy." John's mouth breaks and trembles, and then it tightens back into the thinness again. He makes no sound. "Just mind everything I told you, John." "Yes, Dad. And take good care of Pearl. Guard her with your life, boy." "Yes, Dad." "Who's them men?" whispered Pearl at last. "Never mind them. They come, and I'm going to go off with them children. Don't even waste time thinking about that now. Just mind what I told you. Mind what you swore to do, boy." "Yes, Dad." "Swear it to me again. John, swear, boy." "I swear. I swear." Ben Harper lies in his bunk now, with the sweat beads, little morning dew on his forehead. He does not move lest Preacher may sense that he is awake, frightened beyond all reason or caution, and think that now is the time to break the seal at last and end his quest for the knowledge of the hidden money. But Preacher is snoring and mumbling in his sleep about sin and gold and the blood of the Lamb, and Ben relaxes after a spell and watches the edge of the winter moon in the window. Just the rim of it in the blue square of window, with the corner of one of the wall towers black like a child's school cutout, with a sharp little machine gun sticking out. He closes his eyes, thinking of the day just ended. His wife Willa has been allowed to see him that morning. He looked at her there on the other side of the chicken wire and wanted to say things to her that he hadn't felt in a long time, that he could remember. Back in the spring of 1928, when they had run off to Elkin, Maryland, and got married and spent the first whole night together in a tourist cabin making love the way she had always wanted it to be, instead of sneaking off somewhere to do it. He had thought about how all that honeymoon night they had listened to the whir and roar of the roller skates in the big rollerdrome across the highway, and that record that played over and over again. The one that went, Lucky Lindy up in the air, Lucky Lindy flew over there. And he had dreamed of the life they would have together in the house down in the bottomlands above Crescent Land, and how he would get himself a raise at the hardware store and buy her a player piano. It was funny how it always been a matter of money, right up to the bitter end. Even the day at the prison, she kept asking him about it, the $10,000 he had hidden somewhere. She kept saying over and over that it wasn't going to do him any good, and he had no right to leave her and the 2 kids without anything but the old Bottomlands house her Uncle Harry had left her. Nothing but that and the clothes on their back. But he would not tell, and it made him sick at his stomach to sit there on the other side of the chicken wire and see her mouth saying it over and over again until her face began to look for all the world like the face of the preacher, weak and sick with greed, the same greed that had led Ben to murder and to the gallows. He watched her eyes, all bright and feverish, with hope of finding out, her little pink tongue licking her dry lips with the excitement of it, and at last her mouth gone slack with disappointment when she realized that he would never tell. Yes, he would never tell. That same afternoon, Mr. McClumphrey, his lawyer, had been to see him, too. There was no getting around it. They had all been mighty nice to him at his trial. Mr. McClumphrey had done his very best to get him off with the life imprisonment, and the jury was as nice as a bunch of people you'd ever want to see, and he thought to himself many times since, I wish them no harm, no vengeance in this world or the other. Mr. McClumphrey had told him at the onset that it would surely go easier with him if he was to tell what he had done with that $10,000, and it was really then that Ben had made up his mind not to tell, because any poor fool could see that it wasn't justice they were after. It was the $10,000. So Ben simply said that he wouldn't tell them even if they were to break his arms and legs to make him tell. And Mr. McClumphrey said they wouldn't do anything like that, but they like it not to break worse than that, and couldn't see any possible way to save him then from swinging if he felt that way about it. And so Ben was more sure than ever that he was right. And he concluded with grim Calvinistic logic that if he needed to tell them about the money to be spared the hanging, then there was no real justice in the courts, and so he would take his satisfaction with him to the grave. It was sin and greed that had brought him to Moundsville, and it was sin and greed that was making them hang him. It was the face of Willa begging and wheeling behind the chicken wire. It was the face of Mr. McClumphrey arguing. It was the voice of Preacher in the dark. Where, Ben? Where? Have a heart, boy. Where, Ben? Where? He awoke. The corner of the moon was gone from the window. The blue square was empty except for the ragged thatch of Preacher's head inches from his own. Ben gathered himself slowly under his blanket and let his muscles coil like a steel spring, and then lashed out with all his strength until he felt his hard fist crunch into the bones of the whispering face. Ben, you had ought to have hit me. I'm a man of God. You son of a bitch. Sneaking up and whispering in my ear whilst I'm sleeping, hoping you can make me talk about it in my sleep. Oh, damn you, Preacher. Damn you to hell. Just the same, Ben, you shouldn't have done it, boy. I'm a man of the Lord. You're a slobbering hypocrite, Preacher. Now get the hell back up in your bunk before I smash your head. Some hang for 3 killings as 2. Ben clenched his jaw. Ben lied rigid now, listening as the other scrambles fearfully up in the rustling straw tick and falls back, mopping his bleeding nose and whimpering. Ben finally fell asleep and saw it clear as day, the little room and the rope. His cousin Wilfred and old Uncle Jimmy John Harper got passed to the hanging back in 1930, and Wilfred got sick and had to be taken to a drugstore to be revived and cleared up, and Uncle Jimmy John wouldn't even talk about it when he got back home, and every time one of the Ben's kids would come to him with a rope and ask him to take the knots out, if he would shoo those youngsters out of the kitchen. Ben could see himself plain as day in the little room, and a man was putting that rope over his head, and he saw them that the man was Preacher, and Preacher laughed when they sprang the trap, and Ben was falling. He sprang up in the bunk, striking his head against the wall. "What did I say, Preacher?" "What, Ben?" Now he was scrambling up into Preacher's bunk, and his fingers were around Preacher's throat like rings of a bawling wire. "I said something in my sleep just now. What did I say, Preacher?" "Nothing, my God, nothing, Ben." "You're lying, Preacher. God damn it, you are lying." He tightened his fingers, pressed his thumbs into the gristle of the man's windpipe until Preacher's breath came rattling and gasping. Then he took the hands away for a moment. "I said something. What did I say, Preacher? What?" Ben lifted him by the shoulders and flung him against the wall and banged his head against the stone to the rhythm of his words. Now the other convicts were yelling and banging for silence along the row. What? Preacher gasped and choked. You was quoting the book, Ben." "I which? You was quoting the scriptures. You said, and a little child shall lead them." Ben let go then and got back down in his bunk again and rolled up one of his socks and stuffed it into his mouth before he went to sleep. And next morning when he woke to the siren's vast echo in contralto, the sock was still in his mouth, foul tasting and thick on his dry tongue, but he knew at least that he had not talked. He spat it out and grinned across the cell at Preacher, dressed and shaved long before the morning siren blew. His nose was swollen, and his eyes were puffed and black from the blow Ben had given him. Ben laughed out loud. Nothing would ever stop Preacher. Already the glitter was back in those hunting eyes. Already the questions were forming again behind those thin, mad lips. A feller almost had to hand it to Preacher. "Ben." "What, Preacher?" "I'll be leaving this place in another month. You'll be dead then, Ben. Dead and gone to make your peace with God. Now, if you was to tell me, boy, it might go easier. Why, Ben, with the $10,000, I could build a tabernacle to Jesus, and that would make the Wheeling Island place look like a chicken house. I'd even name it after you, boy, the Ben Harper Tabernacle. How's that sound? It'd be glory to them all, Ben, the final gospel tabernacle on the whole Ohio River." "Keep talking, Preacher. The Lord might feel kindly turned towards you, Ben. The Lord might say, 'What's a little murder?' Would you have free candy for the kids, Preacher?" "Well, yes, I would." "Would you give out free eats to all the poor folks that was hungry, Preacher?" "Don't jest, Ben." "I ain't jesting, Preacher. Would you?" "Well, yes, Ben, if you say so, boy. It'd be your tabernacle. All them poor souls out there wandering around hungry in this terrible depression. All these folks driven to stealing and whoring. Just think, Ben, they'd come there and bless your name. Praise Jesus." Ben Harper bent and searched under the bunk for his other sock. "Keep talking, Preacher." He chuckles. "Keep talking." And the other one had his dreams too. He would lie there in the dark, and when he wasn't thinking about new ways to make Ben talk, he would think about the women. He can never be exactly sure how many there had been. Sometimes there were 12, and sometimes it was only 6, and then again they would all blend together into one, and her face would rise up in the wavering chiaroscuro of his dreams like the whore of Sodom. And not until his hand stole under his blanket and the wound round the bone hasp of the fateful knife did the face blanch and dissolve into a spasm of horror and flee back into the darkness again. He was bad at remembering facts, dates, places, names, and yet fragments would return with shocking verisimilitude. The broken shards of forgotten times, lost names, dead faces. These would return, and he would know for that instant that he had felt toward the time, the name, the place, and how God had spoken clear to him and told him what he had to do. The knife beneath the wool, the sword of Jehovah beneath his wrathful fingers. God sent people to him. God told him what to do. And it was always a widow that God brought to him. A widow with a little wad of money in the dining room sugar bowl, and perhaps a little more money in the country bank. The Lord provided. Sometimes it was only a few $100s, but he would thank the Lord just the same when it was all over and done with, and everything was soothed over, and there was not so much as a single scarlet droplet on the leaves in the pleasant woods where it had ended, and the sword of God was wiped clean again, ready again. Through the leafy, tranquil decade of the 20s, he had wandered among the river hamlets and the mill towns of Ohio and Kentucky and Indiana, doing God's work quietly, without fuss or ostentation. Perhaps it was his very indifference to being caught, his inability to imagine that anyone would ever want to interfere, that kept them from ever nailing him for anything but the car theft in Parkersburg that had sent him to the state penitentiary. Sometimes he found his widows in the lonely heart columns of the pulp love story magazines. Always widows, chuckling, pleasant, stupid widows who would want to sit alone with him on a dusty, bulging Davenport in a parlor, not yet aired free of the sickly sweet flower smells of the dead man's funeral. Fat, simpering hot widows who flirted and fluttered their eyelashes and fumbled for his hand with plump fingers still sticky from the drugstore chocolates. Soft corpse hands that made him retch and hold himself in while he turned to the powdered faces and smiled and spoke of the provident God had brought them both together. And afterward there was a little roll of money to go forth and preach God's word among worlds of harlots and fools. Wandering the land he preached, he would take a room at the cheap depot hotel where the drummer sat out the long summer twilights and watched for the evening train, and after a bit he would spread the word that he was in town and get himself invited to preach at a meeting house, and presently he would announce a big open-air revival by the river for the last week in August. It never brought him much money, but it helped him spread God's glory. God took care of the money. God brought him widows. His real name was Harry Powell, but everybody just called him Preacher, and sometimes that was the only word he would scrawl in the smudging hotel registers. Spring always found him back in Louisville because that was the town of his birth, and because with the burgeoning of the ripe season upon the river, he liked to feel his whole spirit come alive with holy rage and hatred of the spewing masses of harlots and whoremasters he saw in the crowded April night streets in the swarming river town of Sodom. He would pay his money and go into a burlesque show and sit in the front row, and watching it, he would rub the knife in his pocket with sweating fingers, seething in a quiet convulsion of outrage and nausea at all that ocean of undulating womanhood beyond the lights. His nose grows full of it, the choking miasma of girl smell and cheap perfume and stogie smoke and man smells and the breath of 10-cent mountain corn liquor souring and steaming the air. He would stumble out last into the enchanted night, into the glitter and razzle-dazzle of the midnight April street, his whole spirit luminous with an enraptured and blessed fury at the world these whores had made. That night in his dollar hotel room, he might crouch beneath the guttering blossom of a well-spatched flame above a brass bed and count his resources and think to himself, time to go out again and preach the word? Or is it time for another one? Is it time yet, Lord? Time for another widow? Say the word, Lord, just say the word, and I'm on my way. And then, like as not, he would hear God's voice in the haunted, twitching boards of the hotel hallway, above the giggle and whisper and soft, wet fumble on the creaking bed springs of the rooms beyond him, the gagging of the drunkard over in the bathroom by the stairwell. Down in the night, in the Louisville streets, the April tinkle of the cheap music and the coarse night voices were not loud enough to drown out his God-clear command. Once he had nearly been caught, though. It's not like he knew how close he had come to it, nor would have cared much if he had known. He had been solicited by a prostitute along Fray's Alley in Charleston, West Virginia, and had followed her into the house, and smirking at the madam, paid his money, and followed the girl up the stairs past the roaring, rollicking player piano, and when the girl had lain back upon the worn gray spread, and wearily waited him, her jaws not relinquishing even for this business the gum between her teeth, he had merely stood watching, smiling, his eyes alight with the glory of God. Well? Well what? Don't you want it? He said nothing, his head bent a little, one eyelid fluttering, almost closed, listening, hearkening. God was trying to say something, and he could not quite hear the words. You paid your money. Don't you want it now? Say, what do you want, mister? He had his fingers around the bone hasp, and he was already fumbling for the button that held back the switchblade. But God spoke to him and said there wasn't any sense in bothering. There were just too many of them. He couldn't kill a world. But the knife had been halfway out of its pocket before God had finished speaking, and the girl's short, hoarse screams had brought a big Negro handyman up the steps, and he had been kicked and beaten and thrown out into the alley among the cats and the garbage pails. Another night he had taken a young mountain whore drunk to his room in a cheap boarding house in Cincinnati, and she had passed out naked on the bed, and he had taken out the knife and stood by the bed with it unopened in his hand for a while, looking at her and waiting for the word. And when it did not come, he pressed the button, and the steel tongue licked out, and bending by the bed on the worn rug, he delicately scratched a cross into the girl's belly beneath the navel, and leapt there with the brand so frail and faint upon the flesh that it did not even bleed. And when she woke in the morning, alone, she did not even notice it. The faces troubled him at night, not with remorse, but with self-rebuke at the imprecision of his arithmetic. Were there 12? Or was it 6? Was this the face of a gaunt, bony India Coverley from Steubenville? Or was it the other one, her ancient, senile sister Ella, that he had to kill because she had surprised him burying the old woman in the peach orchard behind the barn? The faces ran together like the years, like the long rides in the yellow-lit railroad coaches through the clicking river midnights as he wandered from town to town. Lord, won't I never settle down, Lord? Won't you never say the word that my work is done? Another one, Lord? All right, Lord. And he would plunge into the Lonely Heart columns again, or search the faces at a church picnic. And when he came to the right one, the one that the Lord had meant for him all along, he knew. Then they arrested him for stealing the Essex in Parkersburg and sent him to the state penitentiary for a year, and the fools never even knew that the pair of cheap cotton gloves in the glove compartment had belonged to the one that everybody had made such a fuss about because it was all in the papers. That stone woman in Canton, Ohio, the fool with the 2 children that had been so much trouble because the girl had been so fat and hard to manage on the stairs that night. But the Lord sure knew what he was doing, all right. He had sent him to the state penitentiary to this very cell because a man named Ben Harper was going to die. A man with a widow in the making and $10,000 hidden somewhere downriver. Maybe this would be the end of it then. Maybe after this one the Lord would say, "Well, that's enough, Harry Powell. Rest now, faithful servant. Build thus a temple to my praise. Praise my holy name." He was tired. Sometimes he cried in his sleep, and he was so tired. It was the killing that made him tired. Sometimes he wondered if God really understood. Not that the Lord minded about the killings. Why, his book was full of killings. But there were things God did hate. Perfume, smelly things, lacy things, things with curly hair, horror things. Preacher would think of these, and his hands at night would go crawling down under the blanket till the fingers named Love closed around the bone hasp of the knife, and his soul rose up in a flaming glorious fury. He was the dark angel with the sword of a vengeful God. Paul is choking misogynistic wrath upon Damascus Road. The day they came and took Ben Harper up to the death house, Preacher stood screaming after him, his knuckle-white hands around the shaking bars of the cell. Ben, boy, it ain't too late, boy. Where, Ben? Where, boy?" But Ben Harper did not call back. The game was over. Bart the hangman lighted his pipe. He stood puffing and waiting as the footsteps of his command and comrade rang closer down the cold, wet bricks of the prison courtyard. The others said nothing while Bart stamped his feet and shivered. They looked at one another for a moment and then moved through the prison gate into the deserted street. They walked in silence under the winter trees. "Any trouble?" "No. He was a cool one, that Harper," said the man in the old brown army coat. "Never broke. Game to the end." "He carried on some," said Bart, and the hangman kicked. "But he never told, did he?" said the other. "No." "What do you figure he'd done with it?" "I never talked with him," said Bart, "but I figure he was a feller that wasn't used to killing. A good sort of heart. What I meant to say, I figured he'd done it and was with being shot in the shoulder and half scared to death at what he had done, he just went to pieces and throwed it all in the river." "Ha! $10,000 in the river? In times like this, Bart? Aw, come off it. Ain't no man ever got that scared." "Well, maybe not. But whatever he done with it, he took that secret with him up there tonight when we dropped him." It began to rain suddenly, like tears, a soft, thick river rain that blew in gusts from the darkest hills around the valley. Bart the hangman and the other prisoner guard hurried up Jefferson Avenue toward their homes at the edge of the town. "They say he left a woman and 2 kids," said the man in the army coat. "I never heard," said the hangman bitterly. "My old woman's sister knowed the girl's mother," continued the other. "She was a bailie from Upshore County. Good country folk, Mabel says. And for that matter, I never heard nothing ornery about his folk. Lived in Marshall County for 3 generations. River folk." The hangman hurried on a little, uncomfortable at this discussion of the family and affairs of the man he had just killed. And yet he knew of no reasonable way of silencing the man in the army coat. "Wonder what gets into a feller to make him do such a thing. I declare this goddamn depression has turned up the undersides of some mighty respectable folks, Bart. Yes, yes. I was talking to Arch Woodruff here a while back. He's captain over in that new block where they first had Harper. Art said his cellmate was a short temper from down in Wood County, fellow folks call Preacher Man. Art says that goddamn preacher liked to talk poor Harper's ears off, hounding him night and day to get him to spill it, what he's done with all that money. Kept hollering after him even when he was up in the death row. He paused and thought about it a while. Bart moved on through the rain in silence. I'd be dogged if I wouldn't take a sniff after that money myself if I had my lead to go on. Well, anyway, this short-termer, this preacher feller, he's getting out next month. I reckon he'll go hunting after it with the rest of the hounds. How about his missus, muttered the hangman. Don't she know nothin'? Nary nothin', cried the man in the army coat. He wouldn't tell a living mortal soul. Well, can't say I blame him. Why? Well, just look where it put him tonight, all that money. They parted at the corner, and the hangman walked wearily up the wooden steps under the naked winter sycamores toward the cottage with the light in the parlor window. His wife looked up from her darning when he came in and rising moved towards the kitchen. I hope your supper ain't dried up, Bart, she said. I'll go heat up the coffee. Bart was hungry as a wolf. It always shamed his soul, the vast and gnawing hunger that consumed him the nights after hangings. He hung his wet coat and cap on the antler in the hallway and tiptoed up the stairs to the bathroom to wash up. He could not remember whether he had washed his hands the night after work. At any rate, they seemed cleaner and as bitter. Lemony smell of the glycerin soap touched his nostrils, and he tried them briskly on the coarse towel. Through the open doorway to the bedroom, he could see the sleeping forms of the two children on the big brass bed by the window. He was very quiet as he tiptoed into the room and stared down at the yellow curls of the two little girls asleep on the long bolster. It had stopped raining now, and a cold winter's moon had moved into the night's arena. The pale light shone on the sleepy face of the children. Gently, Bart the hangman adjusted the bright quilt which covered them, pulling it down an inch or two so that the edge of the quilt would not cover their mouths, so that the crisp white sheets would not touch their throats. Now eat, cried his wife when he sat at the table and tucked his napkin from the thick silver ring which bore his name. It's been waiting since 10 o'clock. Bart sat for a moment staring at the napkin before he tucked it in to his stiff collar and seized the fork. Mother, sometimes I think it might be better for us all if I was to quit my job as a guard and get my old Joe back in the mine. The gray-haired woman sat back suddenly in the straight chair and laid two fingers alongside her pale lips. It was a dread thought. Yes, Mom, he said, with his full mouth full of boiled cabbage. I sometimes wish I was back under the hill at Benwood. And leave me a widow after another blast like the one in 24? Not on your life, old mister. He ate in silence, chewing his food slowly and heavily, his face clouded over with speculation. I don't wish to be no widow, cried his wife again. When them two growing kids to raise, no woman does, he said. After a moment, he rose and went to the pump and bent, searching for something. Where's the laundry soap, Mother? I forgot to wash up. 3 weeks after Ben Harper's hanging, Walt Spoon gave Willa a job waiting on tables and counters at his little ice cream parlor at Cressup's Landing. The job paid $5 a week plus meals. The Spoons needed no help. It was just kindness. The first morning Willa left for work, she fed the children their breakfast and told Johnny there was lunch in the pantry, cornbread and a stone pitcher of cold milk and some leftover sausage. The children watched as the window at Willa walked the short stretch of the river road to the landing. John was gravely and silently dubious of the entire business. John, can we get candy at Mr. Spoon's? No. Why? We ain't got no pennies, is why. And because Mom don't want us hanging around when she's working. Oh. Come on, Pearl, he said patiently. Get your hat and coat. Where are we going, John? Out of doors. Pearl scampered off to the hall closet to get her things. John, dressed and ready, stood waiting for her return. Pearl stood patiently while he buttoned up her ragged brown coat and tucked her silly brown curls into the little goblin's cap. Pearl clutched her doll Jenny throughout and snuffled wearily with an old winter's cold until John fetched out his handkerchief and tended to her nose. Now, he said properly, that ought to keep you warm. Come on, Pearl. He paused on his way to the kitchen door and glanced out the window, up the river road to Jander's livery stable. The picture of the hanging man had been washed away in the warm March rain on a night week before, and yet he could never look at the red bricks of the old lichen-stained wall without hearing that chant again. The picture was gone from the stone, and no one sang the song at him on the road, but still he could hear it. Though quite provincially, he was vague in his thinking about what really had happened to his father. There was the feed, store calendar in the kitchen, above the pump, and the red circle of lipstick that Willa had made around that number, that day, and that crimson eye had fixed them all for days, until Willa, in tears one night, had torn the month away and burned it solemnly in the stove. In the red circle was a knowledge that he did not fully know. It had to do with the blue men who had taken his dad away that day. It had to do with the hanging man on the red brick wall by Jander's, and with the song the children sang. Hing, hang, hung. He hummed softly and shivered when he opened the kitchen door, and the March air, piercing and drenched with river cold, swept among them on the threshold. The morning air was thin with winter, sour as lemon. The smoke of morning chimneys rose from the stacks of the houses down at Cressop's Landing and hung for a moment before curling under the gray sky and dragged to earth again like cheap fur collars of old coats. John and Pearl stumped silently along up the dirt road, aimless before the long morning. Howdy, young'uns! John's eyes turned and stared across the street. It was old Walt Spoon, stamping on the stoop of his ice cream parlor and blowing on the fingers of one hand while the other waved 2 green lollipops at them. Through the window, under the pale flower of gaslight by the soda fountain, John saw Willa sipping a cup of hot morning cocoa. He caught Pearl's hand and moved off again, pretending that he had not seen Walt Spoon, nor Willa, nor the green lollipops. Now the children paused before the window of Ms. Cunningham's second-hand store. John made no sound, because there was no sound in the world that one could sensibly make while staring through this particular window, for there was no word for a total wonder, and one could only breathe lightly and in silence against the sorcerer's glass and watch the faint tiny cumulus of breath vapor come and go upon the pane. "What's that? What are you looking at, John?" He said nothing, had not really heard. "John, are you going to buy it? John!" But she would not have understood even if he had tried to tell her, and so he continued to stare through the window into a dusty shelf where the silver pocket watch lay, winked dully among the gimcracks and buttons and fake diamond stick pins and the old Byron campaign badges. Then abruptly there was a motion among the vast panoply of miserable entire coats and vests and pants that served as backdrop to the window shelf, and without further warning this great curtain parted, and the cunning and dissipated face of an old woman appeared and blinked down at the children in the street. Behind the weak lenses of her bent and crooked spectacles, the face of Ms. Cunningham was that of an ancient and querulous turkey hen. her dirty hands fluttering in appalling gaiety to the children, and then disappearing momentarily, she scurried around to the door, which presently opened with a single cry of a little bell like a ragged golden bird. "Ah, if it ain't the poor little Harper lambs!" John said nothing. Pearl was pleased and put her forefinger coyly to her lips. "Ah, how's your poor mother this sad winter?" "She's up at Spoon's," said John, quite cold and matter-of-fact about it, yet uncomfortable lest some of the old woman's coarse and maudlin sentiment brush off on his fingers like a greasy gray dust of certain miller moths. He let his eyes stray again into the wonderful silver watch. Hing, hang, hung. The words rang faintly through his daydreams like echoes of Miss Cunningham's tart little doorbell. Then he looked again at the old woman herself. Well, she was really quite wonderful, this old fat woman. In the end, she got her hands on nearly everything in the world. Just look at her window. There'd be a pair of old overshoes where James Hankin's ice skates were. There was old Walt Spoon's elk's tooth. There's his mother's own wedding ring. There was a world in that window of this remarkable old woman, and it was probable that when Ms. Cunningham, like an ancient barn owl, fluttered and flapped to earth at last, they would take her away and pluck her open and find her belly lined with fur and feathers and tiny mice skulls or myriad dreams. "I'll just bet my two little lambs would like a nice cup of coffee," cried the old woman, fidgeting at her iron spectacles with 3 fat fingers. "Eh now?" "I don't care," said John gravely. Willow never served them coffee at home, partly because it would stunt their growth and partly because it was so dear at the store. Miss Cunningham's kitchen, like her show window, was like a nest of thieving black crows. Old cloth hanging on the water pipes and stove door handles, old shoes in boxes by the door, old hats in apple baskets beneath the windowsill. And because old hats, old shoes, and old clothes bear forever the stance and shape and bulge of the mortal flesh that wore them, once the house of the old woman was place of reflective ghosts, of elbows and bosoms and shoulders long gone in the dust, or wandered away down Peacock Alley to count their pennies on poverty's own lean palm. John and Pearl sat moon-eyed at the littered table, while Miss Cunningham fetched her blue speckled coffee pot and poured them each half a cupful. "Now," she exclaimed heartily, setting down for a bit of dandelion wine for her stomach and a breath of gossip for her dusty ears, "tell me how your poor mother is enduring, children." John shrugged. "I don't know." He smiled thinly. "Ah, now, I mean about the poor father and all. Ah, you poor little lambs. The Lord tends you both these days." At this poetic outburst, the old face grew suddenly awry. One eye twitched as water appeared above the roomy lid, trembled, and trickled in unabashed emotion down the sagging, powdered cheek. "There now," she snuffled, rising gruffly and scratching off the pantry again for her fruit jar of summer provender against winter griefs. "There now, my pets, I'm all right. I really am. It's all over in a minute. It's nothing. It's just that it tears the heart out of thy body, my very breast, to see you young lambs fatherless, and that pretty mother widowed at 30. Ah, and I knowed your dad. Yes, sirree, my lambkins, I knowed him like my own. Many and many is the night he sat right yonder on that hair trunk by the stove and drank coffee with my own dear late departed Clyde." John did not listen as the old woman's voice rose in anguished retrospect. He thought again of the watch in the window. It had 12 black numbers on it, moon-faced, and there was magic to that, for these were numbers that were not really numbers at all, but letters like in words. He shivered at the possibility of such untold magic. But now Miss Cunningham's hen voice came picking its yellow bill through the dream it covered him. "Boy, has a cat got your tongue?" She smiled dreadfully. "Pardon, ma'am?" I said, didn't they never find out what Ben Harper done with all that money he stole? She grimaced and squinted in cunning speculation, as if she was bargaining for a pretty gold pin. Poor Ben. Gracious me, such a lot of money he took that day from poor dead Mr. Smiley. And to think that when they caught him, why, there wasn't so much as a penny of it to be seen. Now what do you make of that, boy? John sighed. He stood up and took Pearl by the hand. Pearl and me, he said, we have to go. What say? What? Why ain't you even touched your coffee? John gathered into his fingers the soft little pads of Pearl's hand and led her back the way they had come, through the mournful forest of dangling coats and through dusty beaded curtains and empty gray dresses with ghosts of perfume about them like the memory of old far wandering loves. Away in the dusty shadow shone the door, the light of winter in the street. Behind him, John could hear the old woman wheezing and snuffling among the fussy garments in his wake. Great day in the morning, she exclaimed. For a boy who don't know nothing about the money, you sure pick 'em run right quick when about... He squeezed Pearl's small hand till she whined in pain and pulled them free and ran ahead, hugged her old loose doll tight against her. At the doorway threshold, Miss Cunningham couldn't contain herself no longer. The fat, ring-crusted fingers clamped tight on John's squawking shoulders and swung him around full face. If you was to tell me, the old voice croaked, all guile and oil gone from it now, why then there wouldn't be no one, none of us three boys, except us. And now, do you know where the money be hid? Do you know where the money is? Did your dad tell you, boy? Does your mama know? Hey, boy, did you see where it was hid? No, cried John and twisted free. The iron bell uttered its harsh and broken cry, and the chill March air flowed among them as they hurried out onto the road again. The old owl face squinted again from among the dusty sleeves in the window racks. The children wandered off down Peacock Alley toward the river. She's bad, observed Pearl. I don't like Miss Cunningham. John stumped on ahead, quaking with fright. John, wait for me. He stopped by the corner under the gun and locksmith shop where the great wooden key creaking hoarsely over the pavement at every whim of river wind. John took out his handkerchief and held it again for the little girl to blow. Hing, hang, hung, see what the hangman done. Hung, hang, hing, see the robber swing. Hing, hang, hung, now my song is done. Was it the children singing in Peacock Alley that morning in Cressup's Landing? The song of the hanging man? No, he knew then it was the rusty chant of the swinging key above his head. Yet in a flash he had caught Pearl's hand and begun walking her swiftly up toward the river's road and the solace of home. It had begun to snow, and the wind grieved in the stark river trees, a wind like a moaning song, wind like a hunter's horn. River dust drifted like a golden smoke among the trees at Cressup's Landing. At 6, Walt Spoon fetched a kitchen match from his vest and lit the 2 gas lamps behind the marble counter. There were no customers in the place now, but when the first movie let out at the Orpheum, 2 or 3 couples would drift in for some of Icy's homemade vanilla ice cream. Now Walt heard footsteps echoing up the bricks of the sidewalk and turned. It was Willa, her nose cherry red with cold. Get them 2 kids fed and bedded down, did you hear? Do it now, cried Walt. Yes, Mr. Smoon. Willa smiled. Better go back to the kitchen and let Icy give you a cup of hot coffee first. All right, thanks, Mr. Spoon. He followed her with his gaze, wondering what kindly thing one might say to a woman whose husband had been hanged for murder. She was so listless, so remote, going about, doing her work well, and yet so hidden away from everything that happened around her. He wanted to tell her that it would all turn out for the best, that it hadn't really mattered what had happened, that each cloud had a silver lining. He followed her miserably to the kitchen and watched from the doorway as she helped herself to coffee at the stove. "Here, honey," scolded Icy, "let me get you that. Sit down and get your feet a rest." Icy Spoon was fat and pleasant. Most of her 60 years had been spent cooking good things, tasting pots of boiling fudge, sampling fingerful of cookie batter or thick ice cream on the wooden paddles of the old crank freezer. Her idea of the world and of its people were as simple and ever and unchanging as the little pastry heart her cookie cutters made. "Willa," she snapped cheerfully, "what you need is a little meat on your bones, girl." Willa smiled wanly. She sipped the black scalding coffee in the thick steam pot china cup. Icy stood before her with fat, freckled fingers, smoothing her apron. After glaring at Willa in mounting disapproval for a moment, she shuffled off to the ice cream freezers. Presently she returned with a heaping dish of the chocolate cream and set it firmly at Willa's elbow. "There you go. A dish of that 2 or 3 times a day, and you'll commence to shape into something a feller might want to look twice at." Willa thanked her and glanced uneasily at the old woman's eyes, knowing well what it was all leading up to. "Honey," said Icy Spoon, waving her husband away from the kitchen and settling her thick, dimpled elbows firmly on the table, "there's a certain plain fact of life that adds up, just like 2 + 2 make 4. Willa kept her peace, not lifting her eyes, knowing that part of her burden as a widow was to endure such preachments. "And one of them is this," Icy went on. "No woman is good enough to be raising growing youngsters alone. The Lord meant that job for 2. Are you listening to me now, honey?" "Yes." "Now then, there ain't so many single fellers nor widowers in Cressup's Landing that a girl can afford to get too choosy. Well, there's Charlie Blankensop, but he drinks. There's Bill Showacre, and he don't amount to much except doing card tricks at social, but he's kind, and he don't touch a drop of the old pap's got some on the farmland." "Icy, I don't want a husband." "Want nothing?" cried Icy, slamming her palm on the table till the sugar bowl shattered. "It's not a matter of wanting or wanting. You're no spring chicken with hot britches, Willa Harper. You're a grown woman, widow with 2 young'uns, and it's them you should be thinking about." "Well, yes, I know that, Icy.
And I don't want you getting the idea neither me nor Walt is butting in," the old woman added, pursing her lips and smoothing the tablecloth with swift outward strokes of her fingers. "You're welcome to work here and even bring them kids in to live here if you got a mind to. But it's a man you need in the house, Willa Harper."
"John, the boy," said Willa. "He's mine's the littlest pearl. He takes awfully good care of her, Icy."
"Minding girls ain't no fit business for a growing boy, neither."
Willa shrugged and looked away. "It's not so easy," she said softly, "finding someone."
"I know. Oh, Lord, I know," cried the other woman, rising and sniffling her nose against the heel of her hand. "All men are such fools."
"Not every man," Willa continued, her eyes grave with her thoughts, "wanted the widow of a man who—"
"A man who done something ornery and foolish," snapped Icy. "Ben Harper was no common robber. Why, I known him as well as I know my own 5 boys, and I have put him up alongside any one of them in these hard, mean times that ruin men, Willa."
Willa stared at the palms of her hands.
"I never really understood Ben. He was always thinking things I never knew. Wanted things I never knew about. But he wasn't a bad man. He just wanted more than his share, I reckon."
Icy's gingham blue eyes squinted shrewdly as she bent and pinched Willa's lightly on the arm.
"There ain't one of them," she whispered hoarsely. "They walked into Moundsville Bank that ain't done been tempted to do the same thing Ben done. And don't you forget it, Lordy. There's been times during this depression when I was afraid of what my own Walt would turn his hands to next." She sat suddenly, subsided, hugging her fat arms against her bosom and reflecting upon the evil season. "That boy John," smiled Willa. "He's so much like his daddy, it's just natural scares me sometimes. So serious about everything. He took his dad's death hard, I guess. Didn't he, Willa?" "Indeed." "He took it like a man, if you would ask me." Willa scooped a tiny mountain into the spilled sugar by the bowl, and her hands trembled. "He knows something," she said in a low voice. "It scares me, Icy." "How?" "There's something strange. He just knows something." "Knows what, honey?" "Like there was something still between him and Ben, and the girl, and shivered on the river wind, said something behind the window, and the boat blew low on the river." "You mean between him and his dad?" "Yes," said Willa. "Sometimes I think about Ben lying there in that little plot of ground between my ma and pa, and him being dead all these weeks, and then I look into the boy's face, and it's almost if—" Off in the parlor, they could hear Walt cranking the Victrola and waiting impatiently for the couple to come in for ice cream after the first show. Willa was white as linen on Icy's spotless kitchen table. "As if him and Ben, as if they made a pact," said the girl at last. "About which?" "About the money, Icy." "That money?" snorted the old woman, poured them both more coffee. "A curse and an abomination before God. I hope Ben throwed it in the river, wrapped around a cobblestone." "But he didn't," said the girl. "Pshaw! I'm sure of it, Icy. He hid it somewhere." "Well, if it is, I don't want to know where. That money caused enough sin and cursedness." "And I think little John knows where it is," said Willa. "What? Great day in the morning, that child? Oh, fiddlesticks, girl." "Yes, Icy. I may be wrong, but I think Ben told him." "Then why, if he told the boy, why not you, his own wife?" Willa smiled sheepishly and plucked at a loose thread at the tablecloth. "He never thought I was fit to know," she said. "Well, fiddlesticks now. Did he say that now?" The girl nodded. "At the prison? Did you ask him when you visit him there?" "Yes, I begged with him to tell. I told him it wasn't just for me, it was for them 2 kids as well. I told him that." "And what did he say to that?" "He said if I got my hands on that money, I would just go to the hell headlong. He said I was a Bailey, and there wasn't even Bailey or Harper, either one, that know the worth of a 5-cent piece, and he said there wasn't a one of them ever got their hands on money that didn't drag himself and all his kin down the fancy road to perdition." "Well now, I never—" Icy pursed her mouth, considered it all. "But then did he say about them kids of his? What did he figure you were going to raise them on?" "I asked him that, Icy." "And what did he say to that?" "He said the money was where it wouldn't even hurt nobody no more. Then he shut up like a clam and wouldn't talk about it any more." "But you think the boy know where it's hid?" Willa nodded and her eyes brimmed and filled. "Icy, honest to God, I don't want the money. I just wish it was all gone somewhere, lost forever, gone to the bottom of the river. When I think about it still being anywhere around us, it just makes me feel sick. Folks staring at me, wondering, sniffing around like dogs, like something awful was going to happen to me and them kids because of it." "Pshaw! Ben was talking out his mind, Willa. The strain of it all. That money is just rotting at the bottom of the river, right where it should be." Willa did not answer, finishing her coffee in slow gulps, while old Icy grumbled and speculated by the stove, rattling her pots and skillets angrily about. "And that's why I say," she exclaimed presently, "that sooner you get a man in that house the better, Willa. There's no such thing that can happen to a widowed woman with 2 youngsters." A glance at the girl told her that this final remark had actually frightened her even more. Icy's face lit up, and she cracked her palms together sharply. "Ouija," she cried. "What?" "The board! We'll just ask old Ouija where Ben hid the money." "No." Willow's lips were trembling now, the color of cold ashes. All right, then, we'll just ask Ouija about that man, the one you're going to meet. Oh, Icy, I'd rather not. You just sit down there, Willa, and mind your manners. I'll go fetch the Ouija board. You can mock it if you will, but me and Walt have found some mighty interesting things from the Ouija than a body ever gets from them tea leaves and cards. Willa sat solemnly with her legs pressed tightly together, listening as Icy shuffled off into the parlor after the board. She was back in a moment and slapped it on the table and sat down facing it, across from Willa. Walt came to the doorway to watch and stood puffing thoughtfully on his cob pipe. Icy's face grew solemn and properly awed as she rested the tips of her fingers on the little arrow-shaped pointer. It takes a spell for Ouija to get a working right, explained Icy, opening one eye to glance at Willa. And don't talk neither. It can get the spirits kind of nervous. Willa's nerves curled in her flesh, and Icy addressed the board. Ouija, please to give us the name of Willa's next husband. Willa felt the sweat gather upon her quaking thighs. It seemed as if there were to tempt old ghosts to speak, to conjure from the blackness of that winter night the face of a hangman who would tell her again with his ruined strangled mouth that she was not fit, that she was weak, that she would drag them all down if she knew. Now the room was stone silent, but the thick bubbling of the tea kettle and the faint cold whisper of river wind against the sills. Ah, there, whispered Icy, see now? And the little pointer scratched sharp and jumped beneath her fingers. Willa shut her eyes and pressed the trembling lids with the tips of her fingers. She listened to the dry little feet of the pointer scrabble across the board, spelling out the letters. Icy's sonorous voice called them as they came. C. L. O. Willa thought. Yes, he was right. The money is bloodied and cursed, and it would take us all to hell headlong, because we were born in sin, and in sin we have lived, and God makes us suffer so we can be free. C. L. O. T. H. Cloth, cried Icy. Now, Walt, whatever do you make of that? Cloth. What kind of sense does this all make? It's a word, said Walt, taking the stem of his pipe from between his long brown teeth. That's plain and simple. Well, sure, honey, it's a word. We all know that, but the question was, give us the name of Willa's next husband. Now, cloth ain't no answer to that. Well, now hold on there for just a while, said the man. That might signify a lot of things. He sat solemnly at the table and regarded the board, scowling. Icy reached out to pat Willow's cold knee and then winked. Walt's got rightly good at understanding Ouija, honey. Just give it a minute. Just wait. It might mean Willow was to meet a drummer, said Walt loudly. A drummer that sold bolts of yard goods. Why, sure, cloth. But now Icy perched her lips and frowned. Well, shoot, a drummer ain't no bargain for a husband. Willa smiled and shrugged. I don't know any drummer, she said softly. What drummer would want to settle down with me? Just you wait, laughed Icy. We'll try again another night. We just mighty good at looking ahead, honey. Now they heard the front door squeak out in the ice cream parlor and the soft laughter of young voices. Gracious, them's customers, cried Icy, springing to her feet. Better go tend to them, honey. Willard hurried off and took the order while Walt put a record on the Victrola, and throughout the next hour they kept business and more business as the kids rolled in to get their ice cream. Icy filled orders for sandwiches and coffee in the kitchen. By 10 o'clock the town had gone to sleep. Outside the snow drifted past in big black flakes and the dark wind had fallen. Willa sat alone by the cash box until Walt came and told her she could go for the night. He and Icy stood watching her move slowly down Peacock Alley toward the river road. Poor thing, mumbled Icy, her handkerchief balled and pressed to her lips.
Walt said nothing as he moved about downstairs, locking windows. After a bit, he came in and stood beside her, staring in the dark that had swallowed up the tiny figure on the road at last. "Poor child," Elsie said again, shaking her head. "I wonder what will ever become of her. It's a story just too sad, enough to beat them picture shows." Because a pipeline ran through the Harper's yard, the gas company gave them a free lamp on a wooden post. A big box with a roof like and a birdhouse with glass sides and a perpetual flame within. It stood by the great oak on the road's edge, and when the wind tossed the branches on the trees, the light from the gas lamp made pictures on the walls of the children's bedroom. The twisted, barren winter branches tossed stiffly in the golden light, and yet with a curious grace, like the fingers of old men spinning tales. And John, lying snug in his bed beside the little girl, shut his left eye and squinted through the lashes at these weaving phantoms of shadows and lights. There was a black horse prancing, lifting its feet to the winter galaxies. And now as the wind changed, there came a three-legged peddler rostering in the mad wind song. And now a brave soldier appeared, then a merry clown with toothpick legs. "John?" "Yes." "Is Mom home?" "Yes." "Is she in bed, John?" "Yes, go to sleep, Pearl." "All right, John. Good night." "Good night. Sleep tight, Pearl. Don't let the bedbugs bite." The little girl lay still for a bit, breathing thoughtfully into the matted wig of her doll. "John?" "Yes." "What's bedbugs?" "Hush up, Pearl. It's time for you to go to sleep." She lay still a moment more and then commenced scratching furiously and sat upright in bed. "Does the bedbugs tickle when they walk, John?" "Hush, Pearl. Go to sleep. That's just a joke when you say don't let the bedbugs bite. There ain't no such thing now. Just go to sleep." Pearl watched the whirling pictures in the light and the yard lamp made on the wallpaper. "Tell me a story, John." She sighed, her eyes lost in the fancies of the dancing shadow branches. John lay still and squinted his other eye. "All right, if you'll lay back down and keep the covers on you so you won't catch your death of cold." Pearl shot down under the sheets again and tucked her legs up tight against her breast, hugging the doll, and waited for the story to start. Once upon a time, there was a rich king. "John, what's a rich king?" "Never mind. You'll see what it means directly, Pearl. There was this rich king, and he had a son and a daughter, and they all lived in a castle over in Africa. Well, one day this king got carried away by a bad man." Pearl already loathed the story now, but still she was silent, thankful enough to hear any story at all, comforted by the droning voice muffling beneath the quilt. "And before he got carried off, he told his son to kill anyone that tried to steal their gold. Well, it wasn't long before the bad man came to try to get the gold. You see, they missed that on the first trip, and these bad men—" "The blue men," whispered Pearl, in a perfect faint of dread. John stopped telling the story. He turned his head away from the dancing things and shut his eyes against the fresh winds, smelling pillow. "John, what happened to the king's gold? Did the blue man—" "Go to sleep, Pearl. I forget the rest of the story." He shivered silently under the warm covers, his fingernails digging into his palms. Pearl sighed and put her thumb in her mouth. Presently she took the thumb out again and blinked at the doll on the pillow beside her. "Good night, Miss Jenny," she said softly. "Don't let the bedbugs bite." And she fell asleep. But John lay still awake, heeding on the winter wind a blowing ball of a steamboat whistle up river at the head of the Devil's Elbow, where the channel straightened and ran up straight through the Narrows. The dark tumbling wind was rollicking with river ghost.
John thought of some of the tales old Uncle Bertie Steptoe used to spin on the deck of his wharf boat on dreaming summer afternoons, of the dark river men, gone now, and cursed and lost in the deep waters running. Simon Girty riding with the Shawnees against his own people, the soldier Mason running with the devil Harper to ravage the river from cave and rock and clean to the sugar coast, Cornstalk and Logan, and young chiefs in the black buffalo robes. Old Uncle Bertie carried the tales down through the river years from a lost time, tales spun round the smoking oil lamps of 1,000 wharf boats from Pittsburgh to the Delta. John rose from his pillow when he heard the thick, even breath of his sleeping sister. Slipping from the bed, John tiptoed across the frosty boards of the floor and fetched his broken cap pistol from the pocket of his jacket. For a moment his own shadow loomed vast and threatened in the golden arena on the wallpaper. The small boy scowled, clenched his chattering teeth, and brandishing the little gun. "I ain't scared of you none," he whispered hoarsely, and made a fierce devil's face at the shadow. And he watched in fascination as it mocked him. The shadow hunched down when John hunched down. It twisted when he twisted, and it bent grimacing to one side when he did. "Blue man, take that!" His mouth shaped the words as his fingers pressed the trigger of the broken toy, and in his mind the wonderful roar of powder filled the silence. But the shadow did not fall. When John lifted the pistol above his head and danced on his numb white toes, the shadow danced and waved his pistol too. John clicked the toy pistol once more, a coup de grace, and stumped grimly. He went back to bed. Now the Shadow Man was dead. He and his kind would come no more to drag the king from the castle by the sea. Beside the body of his sleeping sister, John snuggled his face into the cold, sweet pillow and pressed the toy gun underneath where he could get at it at any moment. And then something in the wind's dark voice caused him to open one's eye again to the square of yellow light on the wall. The Shadow Man. It was smaller than before, but it was still there. He pondered it a moment, lying quite still, his heart thundering in his throat. Yes, to be sure, it was the shadow of a man in the yellow square of light from the yard lamp. Very silent, motionless man with a narrow-brimmed hat and still straight arms. John's tongue grew thick as a mitten at the growing dread within him. "I ain't scared of you," he whispered to the shadow man, and the wind rattled the window like pressing hands. The shadow could not really be there. John was not there to make it, and yet there it was, the neatest little shadow man in the world, and he could see it unmistakably, and it was not make-believe like the clowns and the peddler and the prancing horse with the branches. John slipped out of bed again and crept to the window. He pressed his nose to the icy pane and stared across the deserted snowy yard to the place where the single yellow flame bloomed in the glass box like a goldfish in a bowl of light. Then he saw the man by the roadside. The man stood in silence, motionless, staring speculatively toward the house like a traveler seeking a night's lodging. "Go away, man," whispered John. His flesh gathered for a paroxysm of trembling. Off down the river, the 11 o'clock train of the Ohio River Division and the Baltimore and Ohio screamed twice and hurried off panting among the bottom farms. There was no regular depot at Cressup's Landing, and often the land train from Maudsville stopped in the crossroads to let off travelers on drummers to make their way best they could a half mile to the Crescent Landings and rooms at Mammy Ernest's boarding house. "I ain't scared, whispered John, and saw after a moment that his dread had been unnecessary. It was really a most plain-looking man. He stood shivering for a moment longer in his cheap gray suit and his old gray hat, and even as John watched, he moved back into the shadows again and off up the road to Cressup's Landing. Now the old winter branches made the dancing horses again on the golden square, and the clown with toothpick legs frolicked on the mad wind. John crept back into the bed, and huddling close to the warm body of Pearl, thought carefully to himself. Just a little gray man in a little gray suit and a little gray hat, and he's gone. A pleasant man, too, one would guess, for even now as he wandered up the road for Mammy Ernest, he was lifting his high, clear tenor to the cold night and singing a sweet old gospel tune. Willa said he was a dirty old man and used to forbid John to go there. But to the boy, the old wharf boat at the landing seemed the most perfect kind of home. It wallowed against the lapping slop of the shore, a crumbling houseboat scarcely better than the cheap floating shacks on the shanty boat trash down the shore under the willows at the edge of Jason Lindsay's meadow. Willa had taken Pearl to work with her that morning, and John had a few hours to spend as he chose. Uncle Bertie was just having his morning coffee. When the old man spied John standing timidly on the bricks by the narrow gangplank, he threw up his knotted hands and ran to the door. "Well, bless my soul, if it hain't Ben Harper's boy, John. Hop on up, boy." John smiled, and Uncle Bertie motioned him up the plank. "Oh, come on in, boy, and have a good hot cup of coffee with me. Don't your ma let you?" John's eyes fell. "By dawn, it don't matter if she does or she don't. We'll have ourselves a cups anyway. I say a feller ain't worth a hoot without his morning coffee. Hurry up there, boy, and shut that door, please. It's cold enough to freeze the horse out of the mool's cow." John crept into the narrow little cabin and sat on a salt box by the stove. "Whew! Colder than a witch's tit!" now cried the old man, fetching the coffee pot and pouring John's cup full. "Well, how you been? 'Deed, I hain't seen you on a coon's age, John." "I've been minding Pearl," said John. Bertie cracked his old fist in his leathery palm. "Pshaw now, hain't it caution what women will load onto a feller's shoulders when he hain't looking? Minding girls, shoot, that hain't no job for a big feller like you." "Oh," said John promptly, "I don't mind, Uncle Bertie. Pearl needs someone to mind her." "Well, now, yes, I reckon that's so. I reckon with your pap gone, that sort of makes you the man of the house now, so to speak. 'Scuse me, Cap, while I sweeten up my coffee a little bit. A man of my years needs a little snort to get his boiler heating in the morning." John watched as the old man reached under the bursting leather rocker in which he sat and fetched up a pint bottle of crystal liquid, splashing generously into his coffee. He sipped it, sucked his wet white mustache for a moment, and then fixed John with his twinkling blue eyes. "And how's your ma, Johnny?" "Well, she's fine. She's working up at Mr. Spoon's place now." "Go away now, she is? By grannies, he ain't even boy in Crespin's Landing whose ma works in an ice cream parlor. But she sneak you out a dish of tutti frutti any time you take notion, huh, Johnny?" "Oh, no, she don't like me or Pearl hanging around her at work. She took Pearl up there with her today, but it's kind of special." "And so you figured it was time you come down and paid your old Uncle Bertie a call, huh, boy?" John wriggled his cold toes in his shoes and moved closer to the cherry-red wood stove. Beyond the dusty window, the river was flaked with shards of spring ice. The early thaw had begun, and the cattails in the shallows would lift their brown thumbs to test the first spring wind. John wondered and wandered to the window, and stuck looking out towards the half-sunken boat down on the shore below the landing. "Ain't nobody stole Dad's skiff," he observed softly. "Ain't nobody gonna to either," cried Uncle Bertie. "Ain't nobody had better try. I keep my weather eye on that shanty boat trash down the shore. There ain't a one of them who would swipe and skiff if I was to let 'em. I figure another 3-4 weeks the weather'll fit for me to way down and get her up the bank. Then I'll give her a good caulking and a new paint job, and this summer I'll learn you how to lay as good a trot line as ever your daddy did, boy." John came alive at the prospect. He remembered the times when his dad was home on summer days that flashed with the dragonflies, and they had gone fishing for channel cats and far down river at the Middle Island Creek. "Ah, look, boy, look yonder," cried Bertie, motioned upriver through the window pane. "There comes the Sarah T. Blake." A stern wheeler had appeared small and white on the bend, trailing a dirt stringing of smoke up from her stacks to stain the pearly winter sky. "Ain't like the old times, Johnny," sighed Uncle Bertie, sloshing another helping of liquor into his morning coffee. "Many the forenoon I cleared 5 big Pittsburgh packets at this very wharf." John nodded gravely at the thought of these faded wonders. "Why, just this morning at breakfast I was talking to the new boarder up at Mammy Ernest, and he's daggone it. Anyways, boy, I knows I had something to tell you, and here is clear slipped my mind just telling you, well, I don't remember anymore. Oh, wait, that new boarder, he knows your dad." John grew small and silent, crawling deep within himself, listening with every nerve of his body now shivering. "Yes, sir. You see, old Mammy's been sweet on me for years now, and she gives me breakfast up at the boarding house every single morning. And this very morning the stranger was here, and we got to talking, friendly like, you know, and he said he knows Ben Harper. Well, sure, I popped right up and—" "The Blue Man?" said John. "Which?" said Uncle Bertie. Why, no, he was a preacher. I can swear on that. Anyway, he wants to know about you 2 little lambs, meaning you and little Pearl, and he said he was just itching to do something to help you folks out if there was anything you ever needed. Well, now, he was the kindliest Turner feller a body could look at. He seemed very nice." "Where did he know Dad?" Bertie's face fell as he fumbled in his pants and his whittling stick and knife. "Well, boy, I'm not going to hide the truth. It was at the Moundsville Penitentiary where they had your dad. This here fellow was chaplain, and that's how come he's got to know you, Ben. But wait now, don't get any idea he's one of these here glum-faced, fun-killing old holiness preachers now. Why, he was just a jokey and pleasant and a wheeler drummer with a eastful of samples." John handed the coffee cup back to the old man. "I gotta go, Uncle Bertie." "Oh, well, shucks now, boy, you just got here." "Well, I told Mom I'd be back for Pearl. She doesn't like us kids hanging around Mr. Spoon's place too much." "All right then, Cap, but mind what I promised you now about the skiff. First nice day we get, I'll haul her up and get to work and fixing her up, and then you and me can go fishing." John did not turn back as he ran up the narrow board to the landing and hurried against the wind and blew down Peacock's Alley from the hills. Behind him, he heard the shrill whistle of the little stern wheeler as she passed Crespin's Landing in mid-channel. Now, as John rounded the corner by Jander's livery stable, he saw them clearly through the window of Spoon's place, and his heart rose thick and cold in his throat. There was the man in the gray suit and the gray hat sitting at the soda fountain, smiling and talking with little Pearl kicking her legs over the edge of the marble counter, and Willa standing flushed and pleased with her hands folded in her apron, while Walt, Spoon, and Icy stood by with prim, pleased smiles on their face as they harked to the stranger's word. He was talking to them all. They were just eating it all up like kittens eat cream. And John thought his heart would stop beating altogether because the stranger had Pearl's old doll in his hands now, and he was bouncing it up and down on the little girl's knee like it was nothing but the plainest, commonest doll in the world. Miss Icy whipped the hot fudge till the black stove trembled. "God works in mysterious ways," she said, "his wonders to perform." Walt sat by the window, puffing contentedly on his pipe. Willa stood in the kitchen doorway, weeping soundlessly into her handkerchief, while Pearl, at her knee, buried her face in her mother's apron. John kept apart from them, pale and thin-lipped, his eye cast to the feet of the odd stranger. "And it's a good man," Icy continued, letting a drop of the candy fall in cold winter to see if it balled and was ready to pour. "A mighty good man that would come out his way to bring a word of cheer to the grieving widow. Preacher cleared his throat. I was with Brother Hopper almost to the end, he said in his clear voice, and I lowed as how it would cheer the soul of this poor child to know how brave her husband was, how humble in the face of eternity and the final judgment. Icy, despite herself, uttered a single sob and lashed angrily at the tears with her aproned hem. Preacher, there'll be a place for you in heaven for bringing them tidings to Willa here. As one of the chaplains at the penitentiary, said Preacher softly, it was, of course, my sad duty to bring comfort to the unhappy man during his final days, and now that I am no longer employed by the penitentiary, it is my job to bring this small comfort to his widow. Pearl took her face from the apron and lifted her enormous eyes to Willa. Where's Dad, Mom? Hush, whispered Willa, checking her sobs at last and mopping at her swollen eyes. Icy poured the black fudge onto the buttering pan, and when the pot was scraped at last held it out for John to finish with his thumbs. But the little boy's stony eyes did not turn to see. Icy, guessing how such first-hand intelligence of his father's last days must have stung the child, hurried off and thrust the pan into the sink. Ben Hopper, Preacher said, sitting now at the table and folding his long fingers into a web of tranquil piety, was the last of the condemned men whose troubled spirits I brought comfort to. You say you ain't with the state no more, said Walt. No, brother. I resigned only yesterday. The heart-rending spectacle of these poor men was too much for my little old me. I figured to move on down the river and find myself a little pulpit somewheres. Kentucky, maybe farther. The fingers, John could not take his eyes from them. They rested together on the tablecloth in pale, silent embrace, like spiders entwined. The fingers with the little blue letters. Now, as the fingers stirred, John could see them. He supposed at first that the letters meant nothing. Then perhaps each finger had a name, and the name was a letter. H-A-T-E, the left hand. L-O-V-E, the right hand. Left hand and right hand, and the fingers each had names. Now Preacher saw the boy staring at his hands, sprang apart, and he held them up. "Oh, little lad, you're staring at my fingers." John said no word. His eyes fell back to the stubby black tops of Preacher's shoes. "These letters spell out lessons of life, boy," boomed Preacher with a cozen and unctuous gentility. "Shall I tell you a little story of right hand and left hand, the tale of good and evil?" John pressed his lips tighter. "Speak, boy," cried old Walt, nudging him. "Preacher asked you a question." "Why, yes." "Ah, he's a shy one, poor little tyke," cried Preacher, "and no wonder. Think, my friends, what life has already done to those poor tender years." John would have none of it, but Pearl, who had come and stood by his knee, was wholly won now at the word story, and she pressed her head against his elbow till he noticed her. "Come sit on Preacher's knee, little darling," he cried, and tossed her up and cradled her there while Willa's dark eyes watched, as spellbound as the rest. "Hate," roared Preacher, thrust up the fingers of his left hand so that it all might be read. "It was with this left hand that old brother Cain struck the blow that laid his brother low. And since that ungodly day, brethren, the left hand had borne the curse of the living in the almighty Jehovah." Walt grunted approval and scratched a match on his trouser seat, held it to his pipe, and sucked the flame. "Love," cried Preacher, thrust up the right hand now. "See these here fingers, dear friends? These fingers have veins that lead right square to the heart, to the almighty soul of man. The right hand, friends, the hands of love. Now watch and I'll show you the story of life. The fingers of these hands, dear hearts, they're always a-tugging and a-warring, one hand against the other." Now he thrust his fingers together, left hand and right hand, and now they wrung and twisted one another until the knuckles cracked horribly. "A-warring and a-raging, my friends. The soul of man a-fightin' against his own greed and lust and stinking corruption. Look at them, dear hearts. Old left hand's hate a-fightin', and it looks like old right hand loves goner. But wait now, hot dog loves a winning, yes sir. Old left hand hates a goner, and his last word he brought both hands together with a crash on the table. Hot dog, brothers and sisters, it was love that won. Old Mr. Left Hand had gone down for the count. Icy sliced the crisscross squares of fudge with the long bread knife. I declare, she said softly, I never heard it better told, preacher. Now, cried Preacher Benny to John with a smile, did you catch on, boy? John sighed. Answer when you're spoken to, John, said Willa. Yes, sir. Most folks smiled. Preacher wondered about these here tattoos. When feller has tattoos on his hand, it's generally something ornery, like anchors and pistols and naked females and such. I tell you, I find these tattoos mighty handy when it comes to preaching the word. Well now, said Walt between puffs of pipe smoke, it sure tells me the story. That fudge, Smiley, icy, will be cool directly if we all have some. Well, thank you, sister. I declare, Willa, sighed Icy with a hard stare at John, I never seen that boy of yours so quiet. Looks to me like he could use a good dose of salts. John, take your hand from behind you and act nice. Yes, Mom. Preacher smiled and patted the shaggy head with firm, quick movements. Many and many's a time, he said softly, when I sat listening to Brother Harper speak about these young'uns. Now John's eyes flew to Preacher's face. Well, what did he tell you? The room was silent. Outside, the pale winter sun had appeared, and they could hear the drip, drip, drip of melting snow on the roof. Why, he told me what fine little lambs you and your sister yonder have been, cried Preacher, his washed-out blue eyes twinkling palely. Is that all, John? Willa stirred uncomfortably and went over to gather Pearl from the stranger's lap. Why, no, boy, smiled Preacher. Sometimes his new eyes for a game have begun between them. He told me lots and lots of things, lots of nice things. Nice things, boy. John lapsed in silence again, his hands pushed into his pockets. Well, he said without glancing at Willa, I reckon me and Pearl better go now. Oh, but the fudge ain't hard yet, cried Icy warmly. I promise you a piece if you was good. I don't want no fudge, said John quite plainly. Well, I declare, cried Icy, her mouth pursed angrily. Such impertinence. John Harper, when you don't want something, you're supposed to say no thank you, cried Willa. No thank you, ma'am. I'm sorry, Icy, Willa murmured, blushing with shame. I'll tend to him again when I get home. But Preacher interfered. Now, my dear, we all forget how much of these little lambs have endured. He didn't mean no impudence. Did you now, boy? The fingers. John could not take his eyes off those scary fingers. Did you, boy? John stood quite still, his feet very close together, thinking about his dad that day in the tall grass by the smokehouse, and could not hear what they were saying because he was thinking back, trying to remember the hands of the blue men with the guns and sticks. But because the hands had kept moving, he could not remember whether they had been the hands named Love or the hands named Hate, or whether they had any names at all. Now Willa's breath stirred in her ears, and furious, choked with humiliation. You just wait, John Harper. You just wait till I get you home.